Good morning, welcome aboard everyone. It's been a while that I recorded one of these like talking face videos, it feels like. Of course, we are getting close to the end of the Legion meta, or the Legion era, I guess, in 0 JP, even though for Global is just about to start. And of course, Set 20 introduced some pretty meta-defining decks, some pretty strong ones, some pretty good ones at that. And so of course, as usual, we're going to talk about the meta today, as it's towards the end of the month, so that for you guys in Global, you guys know what's coming up and what to expect, and generally how these decks kind of like ranked amongst themselves in the meta as well. As usual, huge thank you to all the people that support the content, you know, the YouTube channel members, the Twitch subs, and everything. It's thanks to you guys that I can make this kind of content, so I really do appreciate it. As well as, you know, if you give it a like, you know, drop a sub on the channel, that's also very much appreciated. Usual YouTuber stuff. But now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at how the Set 20 impacted the Zero meta. I think there will be once again a big change with Set 21 next month. I do plan to do like a big pack opening stream again as usual, but the problem is that like on the Saturday, so in 2 days from now, I get my second vaccine shot, and so I think that maybe on the Sunday, which is when the set comes out, I might be a little bit dead depending on how my side effects are. So we'll see how what we do. It might just be like a short kind of like half dead stream, so we'll see what we do with it. But it's still gonna be really exciting. There's a lot of stuff that I'm really hyped about in that set, so I'd really like to open everything on day one so that at least I can be like sick in bed and like, you know, or even if they are that heavy, you know, be sick in bed and like test the new decks at the very least. But anyway, enough talking. At least you guys know what's coming up. Let's talk about the tier list. All right, so first as usual, let's take a look at the game with tier list. As usual, this one will be the Japanese kind of like, I guess, view on the meta. And so of course the tier list hasn't changed too much. Of course, Revengers and Bluish Flames continue to be at the top, but from the new additions we have duos, with Nemuel being added to this list because of their kind of like infinite PG looping that they can do, well, quote unquote. And of course Vortex Dragon Yod Kagero has gone up here as well because Kagero is pretty damn strong in this set and therefore, you know, deserves to be at tier 1. All right, so then taking a look at the tier 2 stuff, we can see Seekers kind of dropped off. So Seekers, of course, I think are still pretty high contenders, are still very explosive, very strong, not that popular I guess, but I mean Ganscan's Revolution will always be very strong. I guess the new offered support might push it back into tier 1 in the JPIs, but I personally think it's still tier 1. Genesis Yggdrasil control I guess kind of slowed down because a lot of decks can contest it now, and I guess, I don't know, you still see this deck in ladder pretty often, but I guess it would kind of make sense if you talk about it this way. I'm not really sure why they separate Liberators from Bluish Flames, to be honest. Then they say Link Joker is tier 2. I personally think it's tier 1. I think Link Joker is pretty strong. The rest of this I do agree with. Witches you don't see represented too much, but honestly, like, I play the deck myself on ladder sometimes, and I do think it is quite strong actually. Tetra Burst, I personally don't think it's that great. And of course, there's also Spikes that just came in, which have really strong combo potential, but sadly lack in consistency, which kind of drop it down. So now let's take a look at my own take on the tier list. Alright, so starting from this time around, I want to do things a bit differently. So the tier list you see here is how things were last month. So this is, I literally picked up things from last month, eliminated a few decks that I, you know, have to replace with a new support from the clans, like you'll see Kagero and Link Joker and stuff like that, right? Glendios I kept in here because it's still kind of its own deck, but let's reshuffle how things look from the past meta and then fit in the things from the new meta, right? I think Seekers still stay within the best decks. Maybe Sea Yggdrasil does drop off a little bit here, and I think that that is quite fair. I think Witches also kind of like drop down here as well. Glendios has new support. A lot of people run like Glendios with Legions, and I think for that reason this does go up a fair bit in making it much stronger. A lot of these decks, the other ones here in high effort less return, I think kind of stay in that bracket. I think these decks are still highly competitive. Even if you might not see them as much, I think they still top in tournaments and still get their tops, especially like Ethics Blau top the tournament, you know, it's still out there. This, I don't know, like these decks honestly like are kind of like unrepresented at the same time as struggling, so it's kind of like weird, but I think, you know, it's fair to keep them in whichever side over here. Like they're basically around these two spots, I would say. I think honestly this deck, Neo Nectar, is not underrepresented. It does see play and it does struggle, and I think Mega Colony is starting to struggle too because of the lack of Legions. Everything else here I think is like, these are Legion decks, but just like with, you know, supports of other archetypes that I think are pretty strong still. I think Astaroth I really underestimated. I think this deck is a lot better than I thought. It's not played as much, but you know, having kind of played against it and played with it, the deck is pretty strong. Like, it has tools to really pressure games and like just shut down decks and like deny them counterblast really well. So I think that Astaroth is actually like better than I initially thought, so maybe somewhere around here. And so I think that does it for the rebalance, I would say. I think Tachikaze, I don't think is really struggling. I think it's still like fine, it's still decent, and everything else here I think is pretty okay. Maybe Daikaiser Sinbuster variant also like isn't as good as pure Metal Borgs either, let's say. So then let's start fitting in the new things, right? Perditions, oh boy, Perditions are definitely among the top decks in my opinion. Like, the deck has so many different variants. I think the pure one is like tier 2, but I think if you mix it with Nouvelle and mix it with the End, mwah, beautiful. That's why I took out the End and Nouvelle from this tier list, like imagery, because I think this has just become the Perdition deck list. It will change with the Great coming out next month, which will of course, you know, add a lot to Perditions as well. But Perditions have like, you know, taking away your opponent's intercept, being able to push out damage, you know, denying triggers, so much stuff, like the whole Nouvelle package, the End to push the early game. Like, you guys have seen the deck in fight. This deck is genuinely powerful. This deck is genuinely powerful and deserves to be at the top of the meta, I would say. Genesis Witches feel pretty good. They actually feel pretty good. I think the deck is fairly decent. You don't see him played that much, but I think it's very much like strong combo deck, lots of potential, very counterblast heavy because every superior call costs counterblast, but you can PG search, you can like power up to get over defensives. I think the deck is pretty strong. Like, people don't really play it too much, oddly enough, but I think it's actually like fairly strong. I think Genesis Witches are quite good, better than Shadow Witches too, I would say. Then Link Joker, I personally think is tier 1. I think Link Joker Legion is quite strong, whether you run the World Line version with just full-on Legions, or if you run, you know, just like Legions with the regular starter with like, you know, infinite zeros and stuff like that. I think Link Joker is like, sure, there's tools around it, there's ways to get around it, but a lot of players still don't know how to like play around it too well, and they kind of like end up giving players too much counterblast or too much like field to lock and stuff like that. And I think because of that, Link Joker will stay very strong, and I think it does deserve to be a tier 1, maybe a bit lower than the other decks, because these decks can kind of like dance around it. Like, Shadows can retire their own stuff, like Liberators can run unlockers technically, and of course Thinksaver is, well, Thinksaver, I guess. But I think Link Joker does deserve to stand at tier 1. It does feel very strong in my opinion, and also like this comes from, you know, my player perspective. I play this deck a lot, and therefore my experience with it is also like, yeah, I play a lot of Link Joker. I think the deck is quite strong because I beat a lot of people with it, and I also see people beat other people with it, so that's another big reason why. This deck is, funnily enough, tier 1. Like, Nemuel brought a lot to Bermuda. Well, Bermuda got a Legion that unlocks, so you get a good Link Joker matchup as long as you have that card, and Nemuel allows you to basically bounce a PG and then search your deck for 2 more PGs, so you always have 3, and then you PG, ride, Legion, then you call down the 1 PG left in your hand, use Nemuel's skill to search the 2 of them again, you can use the Roan to search the last one, again PG, and then they also like countercharge, so the counterblast 2 you pay for Nemuel's skill comes back if you manage your hand well. The deck is pretty hard to play. Like, Nemuel is definitely like difficult and very exhausting, and like my brain hurts every time I play it, but if you're a good player, if you know how to like, if you really like that kind of play style, that kind of like slow grindy control, kind of, it's not really control, it's just grindy, it's a grindy deck that can kind of like win a bunch of matchups because it just like lives longer than you. So I think for that reason, like it rewards good knowledge of like resource management, but if you're good at that, this deck is pretty crazy. If you're not, it's gonna flop around and die. So, you know, don't get too excited about like this being like super tier 0 best deck in the format, but it's definitely very good. Bermuda finally like top tier. It's actually quite cool to see. I think Aquaforce, honestly, somewhere here. Like, I was kind of hyped. I felt like the deck was pretty good from you know, on paper, but then when I finally started playing with it, everything needs you to be in Legion. Like, nothing works until you're in Legion. You don't go to Legion until like turn 4, and so you're just like playing a vanilla deck until then, and then once you do, it's like, yeah, cool, you can push damage a bit, you can get restands, then it's great, but by then, like, your opponent's deck has done way more. Like, look at this tier 1, right? How much more they can do. It's like, yeah, you have resist, yeah, you have like ways to move around lock circles, yeah, you have like crit pressure and like draw power and everything. It's pretty cool, but at the same time, it feels like everything's a piece, and it's the usual Aquaforce problem, and everything needs you to be in Legion. So, I don't know, feels a little bit of a, like, it's still good, like any Legion deck is gonna be good, but I think it's like, also needs to be in the right hands. I think this deck, like, it's still strong, but not as strong as I expected. That's kind of how what my stance on it is. And then I'd say that the, like, Bloody Ogle, like Spike Brothers Legion is somewhere up here. It's actually quite strong. I wouldn't say it's tier 1. It's very piece reliant. It's fairly inconsistent, I would say, because you have to have a very specific pattern of things that happen. But when you get the pieces, when it pops off, is very strong. I've yet to really play around with it, but like in terms of upcoming deck and fights, right? I'm doing Aqua Force, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, and I'm gonna learn this. So before we even like, we're gonna be already in set 21, and I'm gonna be going through things from set 20 because just haven't had really time. There's been so much TCG stuff to take care of lately. But yeah, I think this is basically the Legion meta, I would say. This is like, these decks are just kind of like dead. These decks are around, but they don't feel that strong. And then like these decks are there, but you know, it's mostly like the people that really love these decks that play them, you know, myself included here. And then these decks you see in tournaments, you see in ladder, like they're fairly popular, still quite common to run into. Maybe Glendios I'll put down a bit down here. It's still strong, but it's just not like up here, I would say. But yeah, and then this definitely feels like tier 1. I think these are the decks you expect to see on ladder by far the most, and then after that you see the ones from this like highly competitive bracket as well. So yeah, hopefully that gave you a good insight on what the meta looks like for set 20. And so it's a pretty fun time. It's a fun meta. I actually quite enjoy playing Zero right now, especially with like, it's no longer just like paladins, you know, it's a much more refreshing meta to play. I think last set was really exhausting because it was like, choose your flavor of paladin and play it, whereas now it's like, you know, you got Kagero, you got Bermuda, you got Link Joker, you know, you got like Spikes. A lot of other decks are kind of like stepping up to the meta, and hopefully that continues to be the case in set 21. I hope these decks don't just like die out and all we play against is like, you know, Deleters and you know, regular Link Joker and Blaster Joker, and then like the 3 Paladins plus Kagero and Narukami. But even then, that's fairly varied at least. But yeah, that's it for set 20. That's the tier list. That's the meta from my perspective at least. We have the Zero Summer Championship Finals at the end of August, so that's going to give us a kind of good look into what the meta is looking like for the next set, but you'll have to look forward to that when that happens. But anyway, that's going to be it for me today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.